Welcome to New Economic Thinking. My guest today is Lowrey, a contributing editor for The Atlantic magazine and author of a new book, Give People Money: How a Universal Basic Income Would End Poverty, Revolutionize Work, and Remake the World. Annie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, your book is coming at a particularly interesting moment in the discussion around UBI, because it's hard to imagine any policy where you have right-wing thinkers like Milton Friedman and Richard Nixon sharing an idea with people like Barack Obama, the labor movement, and others on the left like yourself. Help me understand this. What do you think UBI really means, and what is it that drew you to try to understand these questions?
Yeah, it's a very good point that you bring up, that UBI has always had this kind of strange bedfellows effect, where you have, on the one hand, libertarians who want a much more efficient, smaller safety net with a smaller government to match. Then you have progressives who are worried about the future of work. So Barack Obama just recently, when he was giving this speech for Nelson Mandela's 100th birthday, suggested that, work isn't really working for people, inequality is increasing, maybe we need this. You have people who are interested in it because of technological unemployment. You even have people coming from sort of a radical feminist perspective. But a UBI is just a tool, and it can be used to all sorts of different ends, and those ends are very different. And I think that gets to one of the kind of tensions in the idea, or the misunderstandings of it, which is that if we had a UBI, it wouldn't make all of these people happy, right? It couldn't be used for libertarian ends at the same time as progressive ends. But it could do one or the other, right? And I think that's one of the curious things about it. It's a policy option among many options, and could be used to remedy different things in different ways depending on how you've structured it. And it's very flexible, even if it gets often boiled down to this idea that it's just everybody gets $500 a month and that's it, and wipe your hands.
I wonder sometimes how much of it is that people have found a label and they've attached all sorts of different meanings, and everyone is bringing to it their own interpretation, and they won't understand until much later that what they're looking at is actually something very different than someone who they thought was their bedfellow might be interpreting it to be.
So there's currently kind of a UBI movement. There's people who sort of support it for every and all reason. I think without completely grokking that you could end up with a policy that isn't achieving the end that you want. So they sort of see, in some cases, UBI is not a means to an end, it is the end itself. And hey, if we had a universal policy that was providing X dollars a month to every American, then it could do, this laundry list of things. It could, be a magic bullet that solves all problems. But, and I think that what you're partially gesturing to is that's not true. There's this question of, and it's just much more complicated than that. What taxes are you changing or raising to pay for it? What programs are you taking away? Are you converting things into a UBI, right? So, Charles Murray suggests getting rid of everything, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, everything, corporate subsidies, and replacing all of that with a $13,000 a year UBI, $3,000 of which would be spent on insurance. But that's a very different thing than I think what most liberals want, and in fact would probably increase poverty in the United States and would provide a lot less help to middle-income families too.
So I find this really interesting because I feel like there's a philosophical basis that many people bring to this, which is in some sense almost a Rawlsian perspective, which is that if you look at it behind a veil of uncertainty, you want everyone to have at least some basic needs met, and beyond that we want incentives to kick in, we want people to have the ability to succeed if they work hard. On the other hand, I feel like if we look at the lens that each of these different groups bring to them, people like Charles Murray, for example, and those on the right often see this as a way to get rid of government. And they are very focused on the efficiency perspective. People on the left tend to see it more through an equality perspective. How do we have a more equal society? Everyone thinks they're bringing fairness and compassion. And then you have the Silicon Valley perspective, which is even a little bit different than that, which is coming from this idea that we're seeing automation change our futures in ways that we can't really even understand from where we are now, and that we're going to have a robot apocalypse and jobs are essentially going to disappear.
Right.
So this is a completely different orientation. Mm-hmm. What do you make of all these different perspectives that people are bringing to looking at this very same policy tool that you're dealing with?
No, I think that you're correct. And I think sort of stepping back and looking at the kind of the Rawlsian, the first principle of, do we want to have a safety net that's actually a safety net? Do we want to, as Americans, guarantee that we are going to stop you from falling down further than X, Y, or Z? We don't have that here, really. We say that if you are a person who's disabled, if you're a child, if you're a senior, then there's going to be a safety net for you. But otherwise, it's really very much all contingent on work, depending on which state you're in. The benefits are wildly different. So there's this idea of, do we want an actual guarantee, like a form of social insurance as a first principle, which I think is a really interesting question. And that's actually what Nixon tried to do. He was saying, look, we want to have a true safety net. We're just not going to let people fall down that far. But then even if you're accepting that kind of philosophical principle, there's the question of universality. So are you truly providing a benefit to everybody? Or is it instead a kind of guarantee with a basic means test? So we're going to provide it to people below a certain level, but not, if you're making $5 million a year, you don't actually need it, right? And then there's the question of how progressive is it? So Charles Murray's option is not at all progressive, which means that it doesn't matter how poor you are, you're not getting more than Charles Murray is or less than Charles Murray is. And then there's a question of how redistributive you are, right? Just like how much money is the government absorbing and pushing out? And there, Charles Murray obviously wants a very de minimis government, as small as possible, as efficient as possible. And yes, not patronizing to people, not picking and choosing how they spend their money, but also really small, right? Like he wants to get rid of huge parts of the government, like almost the entirety of HHS, And so I feel like actually when we talk about a UBI, we should ask people, right? Do you want a universal benefit or do you want a guarantee? How progressive should it be? And how redistributive should it be? Like all of those things are things that I think that you have to ask yourself because people have just wildly different answers to those questions.
I think that's exactly right. So then what was really interesting to me was that you explored UBI in the context of many different countries around the world.
Yes.
So you looked at Kenya's program with Give Directly, which is essentially a donor program with a lot of money coming from Silicon Valley, but I think was very instructive in terms of what it tells us about people's desire to work.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I think it's worth noting that, in lower income countries, cash benefits are not like a surprising or new thing, right? We have unconditional cash transfers and conditional cash transfers that are just enormously popular, even in very low income countries. Because there, I think that the goal is clearer, right? Like if the state has capacity, it wants to get people out of extreme poverty in a lot of cases. And we have the example of, Bolsa Familia in Brazil and Oportunidades or Progresa in Mexico, that it just showed that with very small numbers of conditions, so, keep a kid in school and get them vaccinated, cash transfers work really well to get folks out of poverty. And so I think that that's also true in Kenya, where they're kind of, there I'm not sure that the state has enough tax revenue to redistribute, but you can take money from a place like Silicon Valley and distribute it really, really well. And no, people don't stop working there because, those dollars are so important to them. In some cases, the fact that they are so poor is in fact a barrier to work because it's very hard to get transportation. If you get sick, you're not going to be able to do anything, And so they haven't found that there's a work disincentive effect. And I think that you're right, that there's a message for higher income countries where, in the United States, whether it was through Simon Dime or through Mincome in Canada, we know that there is a work disincentive effect with these kind of cash transfers, but it is smaller than you would think. And the folks who stop working, tend to be the mothers of small children, tend to be young people who want to stay in school, tend to be older folks who want to perhaps retire a little bit or work a little bit less. And so there, I think it becomes pretty quickly a values question of like, is that such a bad thing? It's not. Certainly those things are socially useful and really are not implying some sort of laziness, which I think is this kind of persistent belief that people, if you give them the money, will just stop working. And I think it's a little bit more complicated than that.
If I think about a country like India, for example, where you say they do have a lot of cash transfers, and or Brazil, where they're comfortable with this idea of cash transfers, in some sense, in very poor countries like this, it's harder to have means-tested programs, so it makes sense, and the results are quite powerful, that just giving people cash has a strong effect. But that's not really the situation that we're in the US.
No.
So I saw some of the calculations you did in your book as to how much it's going to cost to actually give everyone a check for $500 or $1,000.
Right.
And then you get back to this question of how does that compare to a means-tested program?
Right.
So as you say, we could do a UBI, which is somewhat means-tested, but then of course it's not really universal.
Right.
And then there's a question of why go that route? Why not use something that is more directly means-tested, which gets around some of the issues that are obvious, that you don't want to be giving $1,000 to Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates.
Right. So I think that there are sort of two buckets of issues that I think about. So one is means-tested versus universal. And then the second is this kind of question of how complicated or arduous the application process is. So is the means test just, are you low income and do we know that from your tax return? Or is it you have to be certified to have a disability, you have to recertify every 6 months, you have to comply with a work requirement, where you're splicing really fine. And we know with programs like TANF and SNAP that in many cases, participation rates are not as high as they could be because there's so many hoops to jump through, so many tests, right? In a lot of states, they asset test for SNAP. So basically, they're saying if you own a piece of property in upstate New Hampshire that you inherited from your parents and you're growing Christmas trees on, this is literally somebody who I talked to, even if you're very low income, you've failed the asset test and you don't get SNAP. So that's like a complicated testing paradigm where you're just making the program smaller, right? Whereas I think that there's this kind of question of like just basic means testing. Are you beneath 133% of the poverty line? Where then the question becomes like, okay, how many, what resources are we putting where? Because I think that if you actually look at the anti-poverty programs that we have now and the people that are excluded from them, even when they're very, very poor, in some cases extremely poor, it's because of that latter set of issues, not so much the former. And means-tested programs have performed really just unbelievably well at moving people out of poverty in the United States, whether it's through the EITC or through SNAP or any of the other big programs. So, the kind of argument for not means testing at all, for having something be universal, that UBI advocates make is that if everybody is getting something, it becomes kind of a middle-class entitlement, sort of like Social Security, and then it becomes very hard to take away, right? If everybody loves receiving their $1,000 or $500 a month, and people would agitate against having that sort of rolled back, that it would protect the program in the same way that you see seniors protecting Social Security from cuts by either party. But I do think that there's this way in which if you are trying to use a UBI or a UBI type program for poverty relief, that doing something like a guaranteed minimum income where you are means testing through the tax code is going to be a much more achievable and perhaps dollar for dollar a much better bang for your buck. It all depends on what you're trying to do, right?
Right, which I think is why this is such an interesting question. Yeah. Because if I think about some of the issues that we're trying to address, I feel like UBI does a really good job theoretically of providing a floor for everyone. But I do believe that it doesn't necessarily address some of the issues that its proponents would like it to be able to. For example, the issue of structural barriers to economic mobility. So if I think, for example, of the work that Bill Lazonick has done, where he's shown that essentially we've had this shift of profits being distributed between shareholders and workers to increasingly have them diverted more towards shareholders.
Yes.
This is a structural issue. If we think about some of the issues that Silicon Valley is bringing to the table in terms of the technology changes, we can talk about redistribution through simply giving cash handouts. But many people start thinking in terms of, why don't we talk about ownership? Why don't we talk about the shareholder-stakeholder model with respect to that as well? Do we really see UBI as being on an economically efficient frontier in this perspective? Or should we be thinking about addressing these issues through some of these other means?
So Andy Stern, I think, is formerly president of the SEIU, the big labor union, I think is the foremost proponent of the idea that a UBI would act to address income inequality, automation, decline of unionization, the issues that you're discussing, which have been, the most strong tidal forces in the American workforce over the past 30 or 40 years, ones that, as so much of INET's work has shown, we've not sufficiently addressed. And so the idea being there, basically, if you had $500, $1,000 a month to fall back on, you could demand much better conditions from your employer. You could refuse low wages. I am not sure that it actually addresses the root cause, as you describe it, the catastrophic loss of worker power, right? I think that you can ameliorate some of the issue, but I think that probably you want policy changes that are attacking the heart of that, right? Whether it's regulatory changes, so increasing the minimum wage in some places, providing stronger worker protections, requiring employers to provide things like leave. People don't talk about trying to figure out how to increase unionization rates anymore, but surely unions help workers, and I think figuring that out would be great. And then, it's so funny that you're gesturing to these other seemingly more radical but quite sensible ideas of making workers shareholders, right? Having them have a stake in companies too, and
or at least stakeholders, so that when we create policy, we have some idea of how much of it gets plowed back into the company and the people who built the company.
Right. And it's funny because politically now there's such interest in this idea, since there's now, it's so new and the tax cuts are so recent that I don't think we know exactly whether companies use them purely on share buybacks, but they certainly used a lot of them on share buybacks.
That's right. So we're seeing it, still in 2016. 2018.
Yeah.
It's very similar issues.
It is, and it's just an exaggeration of this phenomenon that we kind of throw our hands up. And I don't think we have to. There's many levers to pull here. There's all sorts of policies that you can imagine that would really just force employers to make conditions better.
But the interesting thing is that those policies require us to go through regulation channels, and the whole point of UBI in some sense is to deregulate and to make government smaller. So in some ways I see them as clashing.
Yeah, it's certainly there. There's this kind of, I feel like there's been this long-running conversation of whether the government should be fixing inequality pre-tax, pre-transfer, focusing on that, or focusing on post-tax, post-transfer. And the answer is surely both. Right. But sometimes I feel like they don't even try with the pre-tax, pre-transfer.
That's right. And one has to worry that if the reason we're thinking about UBI is really that automation is going to take over such a large percentage of jobs, we are, I think, going to have to think about, in the long term, how do we develop a society that looks like a society we want to live in, so that everyone feels like they have some place in it and some part of this.
Right. When you're in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, there's just this deep, almost religious belief that everybody's going to be out of a job. And the thing that I think is hard about that is that a UBI doesn't solve the problem of there not being any work, right? Taking somebody's job that they're making $60,000 or $70,000 a year at and replacing it with a $24,000 a year, even more than that, cash transfer is a recipe for societal breakdown. And I think that you actually get to this really good point, which is like you have to make the economy work for people, and transfers are not the only way to do that. And maybe they're necessary, but they're not sufficient.
I'd be really curious. You've spent so many months researching it. Where do you come down in terms of what you think we should be thinking about in terms of the tools that are most effective for dealing with these different concerns that we have? So poverty, which you discuss a lot in your book, but also automation and the future of work.
Right. So on the automation and the future of work piece, I feel like the policy needs are complicated, but definitely veer towards what we were talking about before. Making workers shareholders and stakeholders, increasing unionization if possible, doing things like increasing the minimum wage, requiring workplaces to provide flexible scheduling and benefits, increasing the rate of insurance coverage, which we do not have even close to universal coverage despite the change that the ACA had. In terms of anti-poverty policy, it's hard to see a UBI kind of being in the Overton window now, but I do think it suggests a lot of ways that we could do things better. There's absolutely no reason that we couldn't have a negative income tax that could actually eliminate extreme poverty in the United States. It wouldn't even cost that much relative to what we're actually already doing. Nobody talks about that. Things like the elimination of child poverty, which I think I was looking at this the other day. Denmark's child poverty rate is something like 3 or 4%. It's more than 20% in the United States. This is a disaster from a policy perspective. And it's something that I just think that Washington is really unresponsive to, no matter how many politicians and policy experts talk about what a terrible moral thing, and also that's just terrible investment terms, right? We know that getting kids out of poverty increases their educational attainment, makes them healthier, and makes them likelier to work. Why wouldn't you want to do that? Right. So there, I think having something like a universal child grant, so getting rid of TANF and having just a grant to kids, maybe means tested, so it's just aimed at poor kids, would be really effective, or a negative income tax. And in terms of the thing that I think is most fascinating is, say that, or not most fascinating, but a fascinating thing is, say that work is really eliminated at some point 25 or 50 years in the future. It's not just going to be a UBI that's going to fix that.
Right.
We're going to need something else, really deep changes, I think, both culturally and economically. Right. And then to go back to one of the other issues we were talking about, just in terms of the inequality piece of it, stagnation of the middle class piece, I think that there's now more desire among progressives for something like an expanded EITC, taking care of educational debt, that issue, perhaps more investment in disinvested communities. But I'm excited to see, given that I think that people now, almost 10 years out of the recession, are still increasingly fed up. And this is why I think you've seen this really fascinating resurgence of, arrival of these really popular democratic socialist politicians. So I have to imagine that there's going to be many more policies brought on the table to address those issues as well.
I feel like this is a really refreshing, nuanced approach to thinking about UBI, because I feel like many people come at it from their own lenses and tend to have very strong views based on that. But it really is, as you say, a tool, and it's complicated, and it depends on how we choose to use it, and we have to figure out how to balance our different options. So I really appreciate your book and the ideas and just the nuanced perspective that you bring to it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope it's like a fascinating, I think of it as like a piece of playground equipment, right? It's like a fun idea to like play on and with. And so thank you so much for having me.
It's a great analogy. Thanks.